It's not enough to talk the talk anymore. We must all walk the walk. This truly is a crossroads moment for our city and for our planet.
Good morning in the United States. Good afternoon in England. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Welcome to Washington Post Live. Mayor Sadiq Khan, the first Muslim mayor of London, elected in 2016, just won re-election to a second term in May. And there's a lot on his plate, from COVID to climate to crime. And we're going to talk about it all right now. Mayor Khan, welcome to Washington Post Live.
It's an absolute pleasure to join you. And I'm going to try, Jonathan, my best not to look over your shoulder at your bookshelf. I deliberately, I learned early on, Jonathan, during this awful pandemic, when you do interviews, try to have notebooks behind you because people then look at the books I'm reading rather than the interviews. But it's lovely to join you and the Washington Post for the next half an hour or so.
Well, Mayor Khan, I should also, yes, people look at the books behind me, but they also pay attention to the flowers. I mean, the folks have a lot of time on their hands, but let's talk about more serious matters. And let's start with the pandemic. As mayor of a major financial center, London is a global city. How has COVID affected the residents of your city?
Well, whenever I begin these conversations, I think about the lives lost. We're talking about a global pandemic that's led to the loss of lives and livelihoods. I've always thought since the beginning, since around March 2020, when this first became something that we realized was happening, that you've got to link the health of individuals with the health of our economy. And over the last 18 months in London alone, 20,000 Londoners have lost their lives. And we've also discovered early on, this had a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, minority ethnic people, on poorer people, which both exposed and exacerbated the structural inequalities in our society. But at the same time, it's been really hard for those businesses that rely upon footfall for their success. Think of our theatres, our bars, our restaurants, our transport system, our coffee bars, and so forth in the centre of our city. But the good news is we're bouncing back. The good news is over the last few weeks and months, we've had a massive campaign, Let's Do London. We've seen the return of people to the centre of our city, including many American friends returning to London, and we're making a good recovery.
As you were speaking, and it's nice to hear that London is bouncing back and people are returning. But I'm just wondering about the handling of the coronavirus pandemic, the disparate handling between, across the world, in the EU. And I'm wondering the impact of the uneven policies and vaccinations around the world in the EU. And also I'm wondering the impact of that on your efforts in London, but also if you could talk about the impact of Brexit, if that has had any impact on the way you've been able to respond to the pandemic.
Well, Jonathan, you've heard the phrase, which is really important for us to actually listen to the phrase and understand it. None of us is safe until all of us are safe. What that means is until the entire planet, those of us living in this wonderful planet, have been vaccinated, actually none of us is safe, right? Or as many people as possible receive the vaccine. One of the things we discovered early on during this awful pandemic was actually you need to have good, strong leadership. You need to be able to pull the levers and know things are happening, but also you need to understand the lessons you can learn from those cities and those countries who, for a variety of reasons, are experiencing the virus before you are. So I spent a lot of time last year in March, April, May in particular, but even up until now, speaking regularly to leaders across the globe. That could include mayors, national leaders, those in the private sector, those who work in the health organizations across the globe, to learn best practice, to copy what's working well, and to avoid the mistakes being made. One of the things that I think hasn't worked well is making sure that we explain to people the scientific evidence, what this virus is about, what it means, and the simple things you can do to ameliorate, to reduce the chances of you catching the virus, social distancing, making sure you wear a face mask when you're in close proximity, and so forth. But also the things we can do to reduce the chances having the vaccine, having not just one dose, having a second dose as well. And now we're talking about the booster dose. And so it's really important we learn those lessons. In relation to Brexit, it was a huge challenge because we had two things happening at the same time. Us leaving the European Union, but also at the same time, this awful pandemic beginning. And I'm afraid those two things have conflated some of the consequences to London as a city and to our country. The good news is, and it is good news, is even though we're outside the European Union, we've worked really closely with our colleagues across the European Union. So, for example, there's been sharing of vaccines, there's been sharing of good practice, there's been sharing of information. That's, I think, important because it saves lives at the end of the day.
Mayor Khan, I'm wondering, in London and in England in general, are you finding the level of resistance to vaccinations in the same way we're seeing here in the United States? People who are actively resistant to the science.
There's three groups of people in that category, Jonathan. One are the anti-vaxxers, two are the conspiracy theorists, the COVID deniers, and three is people genuinely, for good reasons, aren't quite sure about the virus, aren't quite sure about the vaccine, and need to be educated, small e, non-patronizing, to be explained how you catch the virus, but also that actually, although this vaccine was produced incredibly quickly, because the entire world's attention was focused on a vaccine, it is safe, there's been clinical trials and so forth. And what we have in the West in particular is a suspicion by some of people in positions of power and influence, because their lived experience is not to trust them. So you can understand why some communities don't trust pharmaceuticals, why some communities don't trust government ministers. And so we've had a big job trying to bust myths, trying to use respected message carriers who these people trust to deliver messages, trying to expose people to the science. I've got to accept, though, that the small number of anti-vaxxers, the small number of conspiracy theorists, probably never going to be persuaded. You've almost got to write them off and work on those people who you can persuade, you can educate, you can bring to the table.
I want to go back to your phrase, bouncing back. London is bouncing back. The Financial Times reported that an estimated 700,000 Londoners left the city during the pandemic, creating massive labor shortages. By adopting the phrase bouncing back, am I to take from that folks are starting to return or have returned? Yeah,
it's a really important point you raise, and actually it's potentially existential to global cities like London, New York, Paris. What happens when the centres hollowed out because of a pandemic? So there are a number of reasons why we had, as you said, according to the FT reports, lots of people leaving. Combination of Brexit, Londoners, and the Londoners, by the way, whose country of origin may have been France or Germany or Poland or Romania, returning to country of origin because often the jobs they did were in those areas, hospitality, culture, where lack of footfall meant there wasn't any job to be done. And secondly, many Londoners who, because they weren't working in a bar or a restaurant or the normal stuff they did in theatres, went back to mum and dad's home around the other parts of the country. And many of these Londoners, Jonathan, are what I call boomerang Londoners. They've returned when their jobs returned. They've returned when there's something to do in this great city. Because one of the reasons people choose to live in London isn't simply their work. It's because we've got the whole shebang. We've got great nightlife, we've got museums, we've got galleries, we've got great theatres. You've got your friends who you can see during lunchtime at work or after work to go for a drink. And all that disappeared. And now that's coming back. People are coming back as well.
I like that phrase, boomerang Londoners. I can imagine that there might be some mayors here in the United States who might take that first word and use it for themselves.
There's another phrase, Jonathan, which you'll appreciate. As speak as a parent of children who grown up, there are boomerang children. They return home as well.
I like that. I'm writing all of these things down, and you're a gold mine of great phrases. You know, one of the things that you are most known for is for being a vocal leader on climate change and sustainability. And I want to let the viewers know, particularly here in the United States, that earlier today in London, you were announced as the next global chair of C40 Cities, which is a network of nearly 100 cities, 100 of the world's leading cities that have committed to tackling climate change. You don't formally assume the role until the chairmanship, until I think it's December 1st. What are your plans once you do? And if you could talk about the importance of C40.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I mean, the key thing we've got to get across is across the globe is climate change isn't something that affects us in 10, 20, 30 years time, or only affects those people in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia. It's happening now, the consequences of climate change. You've seen it in the awful floods in New York. You saw the loss of life there, in the wildfires and so forth taking place across the globe from Greece to Australia. We saw it in London, flash flooding this summer, which meant a lot of our tube stations were closed down, many homes flooded. In Germany, you've seen the awful fires taking place there. So it's happening now. And one of the things we also know, you and I both are good examples of this, is most of the world's population live in our cities. But the way COP26 works is it's national governments reaching agreement how they can reduce their greenhouse emissions. The reality is, though, the only way we're going to be successful at fighting climate change and deal with the other twin challenge of air pollution is by cities be given the powers and funding they need to bring about meaningful change. And I'm incredibly proud to be the next chair of C40, taking over from my good friend, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti. We represent almost 100 cities across the globe with a population north of 700 million. And we are responsible, I'm proud to say, for more than a quarter of global wealth. So we're really important. And the great news about C40 is this is a global group of networks coming together. We're saying we want to have bold policies to address the twin challenges of climate change, to get to zero carbon as soon as possible in London. Our aim is net zero carbon by 2030, but also air pollution. We want to get to zero pollution as soon as possible as well, because we don't talk much about air pollution. This is an invisible killer leading to premature deaths, leading to children having stunted lungs forever, and adults with a whole host of health issues from asthma to dementia to cancer to heart disease. And it's really important that we lobby our governments to make sure COP26 in just a couple of weeks' time is a success.
And you mentioned Eric Garcetti, who is the outgoing chairman of C40, mayor of Los Angeles, who is going to become, or was nominated by President Biden to be the United States ambassador to India. You've mentioned COP26 several times now. It's going to be happening in a couple of weeks, just up the road a piece from you in Scotland. I'm going to ask this question carefully because it deals with American domestic politics, but right now we're going through a situation where the president is trying to get a reconciliation bill. Climate was supposed to be a big part of it. The president's trying to get it done before he heads over to COP26. As the mayor of London and as an international leader, how important is it to you, but also to the world, that the American president and the American government comes to the table at COP26 with something tangible that he can bring to the table, showing that the United States is part of the global effort at climate change?
I'm going to say this.
About climate change.
Yeah. To those watching this in America, I'm not sure if you fully understand and appreciate how much many of us around the globe revere you, look up to you, and look to you for leadership. And you know, many of you won't be surprised for me to say that actually for 4 years you were missing in action. And not only did you, because of your president at the time, walk away from the Paris climate change agreement, but many of the things that your government, your president, was saying and doing were the antithesis of being change makers and solving the challenges posed by climate change and other issues as well. The election of President Biden has been warmly welcomed by many of us across the globe for a variety of reasons, not least of which is his commitment to sign up again to the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And you know what, him appointing John Kerry, Secretary Kerry, to be the climate change envoy was the boldest and best example of leadership in action we've seen for, I'm afraid, 4 years from the country that I love, the USA. And I met John recently, and the leadership your government is showing through a combination of President Biden, John Kerry. You've got brilliant mayors in America doing great jobs at a local level, but you are the most important player when it comes to solving problems around the globe, whether it's terrorism, whether it's issues around provision of energy security there, or whether it's climate change. And President Biden coming to Glasgow says something. The fact that John Kerry is speaking on a daily basis to leaders across the globe, trying to persuade them to provide the $100 billion we need a year, but also to get away from coal, have policies that leads to us addressing the climate emergency is really important, really important. I know we're disappointed that President Xi and President Putin won't be there in person, but they will have people who will be there. And so, we look to you, as we often do, for leadership here. And I'm looking forward to seeing President Biden in action in Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time.
And more specifically to your efforts in London, how do you plan to bring more green jobs to your city?
This is a really important issue. So one of the things we've got to get away from is giving the impression that climate change is all gloom and doom. We've got to give hope. I this Sunday spent some time with our Prince William, and Duchess Kate as well. And what was their first, which was the Earthshot Awards. And Prince William talks about how, just like in the early 1960s, your president JFK talks about, in just under 10 years, having somebody on the moon shot. We need to have an Earthshot. And we are leading in London. We're the first Earthshot city. And what I'm trying to explain to people is actually this solution to the climate emergency, to air pollution, is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to create green jobs. Our economy in London is one where we have £50 billion green economy, 317,000 people employed in the green economy. I want to double that over the next 10 years. We can do that by more electric vehicles, electric charging points, retrofitting our buildings, cleaning up our air, having electric buses, and so forth. This is a solution to a problem. I call it a virtuous circle.
I was just writing down a question that I'm going to ask you at the end. Do you have, and you may have said this in your answer sort of obliquely, but what are your major green job projects that are in the works?
Yeah, so we began in 2019 the first ever ultra low emission zone. And what that basically is, Jonathan, is one of the things I realized is the issue of air quality is an issue of social justice. It's the poorest Londoners, the poorest people across the globe, who are least likely to be responsible for the toxic air, climate change, in our case, emissions from vehicles, who suffer the worst consequences. So, it's those who don't own a car, those who are the poorest, those who are Black, Asian, Morrison ethnic Londoners who suffer the worst consequences of air quality. So I brought in a policy called the ultra low emission zone, and it basically used the principle the polluter pays. If you have a polluting vehicle and you want to come into the centre of our city, you've got to pay £12.50 a day to do so. And we've seen over the course of 2 years before the pandemic began, a 50% reduction in toxic air in the centre of our city, plus, by the way, carbon reduction as well. And this coming Monday, we're going to be expanding the world's first ultra emission zone up to all of inner London. So it'll cover 4 million Londoners. And from Monday, if you want to drive into inner London, which covers 4 million Londoners, and your vehicle is a polluting vehicle, you've got to pay a big fee to do so. And the idea is to discourage people polluting, to encourage instead walking, cycling, using public transport, or driving a zero emission vehicle. And I'm hoping this will set the template for other cities across the globe, but also it's creating jobs. It's creating jobs with those who make electric vehicles. It's creating jobs in public transport. It's creating jobs in those who make bikes. It's leading to a better environment in London as well. And one of the things we're going to do at C40 is to share best practice across the globe.
So we've covered climate change, we've covered the COVID pandemic. Now let's talk about crime and violent crime in London. Like so many urban areas here in the United States, London has experienced an uptick in violent crime since the pandemic began. How are you addressing it?
Well, first, I speak regularly to mayors in your country, and also we speak to those who run the police service as well. And one of the things I want to say, which is not to excuse criminality, but just to explain the causes of criminality, is they're deep and complex. Deprivation, poverty, alienation, lack of opportunities, and so forth. And so we've got to understand why crime occurs. So we've got to support those communities to give them the opportunities so young people are given constructive things to do, diverted away from joining criminal gangs or getting involved in criminality, at the same time as suppressing violence by supporting the police, making sure they've got the powers and resources they need, as well as the right scrutiny, so there are the right checks and balances. The phrase used by previous leaders of our country, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, was tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. And the good news is this sort of public health approach, where we treat crime as a virus. How do you treat the virus? You stop it occurring in the first place. If it does occur, you stop it spreading, and then you make sure you do public health things to stop future viruses occurring. We're going to treat crime in the same way, using data to laser-like focus on those parts of our city where there is crime, where there are communities where there's more deprivation, to support those communities. And the good news is, over the last few years, we are seeing a reduction in violent crime. And during the pandemic, we saw a further reduction in violent crime. Knife crime injury has gone down. Knife crime injury for those below the age of 25 has gone down. Burglary is down. Robberies are down. Homicides are down. No complacency at all. We've got to make sure we redouble the support we give to communities and the support we give to the police, because the reality is, just like criminals evolve and find new ways to try and cause us harm, we've got to evolve and find new ways to keep our communities safe.
Mayor Khan, talking about that, there's a headline out of London that took the world by storm, just by how shocking it was, and that involved a London police officer, Wayne Couzens, who kidnapped, raped, and murdered 33-year-old Sarah Everard. And this was back in March. He's received a life sentence. But he used, according to reports, used police ID and COVID laws to falsely arrest and handcuff Everard, and then, as I mentioned before, killed her. Has that horrific crime eroded the public's trust in police? And if so, what are you doing to mend that divide?
It has. It's shattered the confidence many people have in the police service, particularly if you're a woman or a girl. This was somebody who wasn't just a serving police officer, but used his position to abduct, rape, murder, and then burn Sarah's body. And so we need to make sure that we understand fully what happened. Were there any missed opportunities to stop him joining the police service, stop him being transferred in? But also, we've also discovered he was part of a WhatsApp group with other police officers, sharing messages that were not just misogynistic, racist, homophobic as well. And so there are separate inquiries into what went wrong, but separately we need to make sure we earn back the trust and confidence, particularly of women and girls. And that takes an approach that isn't just the police's problem, all of our problem. We've got to be looking at our society. How is it acceptable that girls and women change their behavior because of what men do? How is it acceptable that women often have a self-imposed curfew, not going at nighttime because they're worried about their safety? How is it acceptable that boys use certain sort of language in schools that leads to girls changing their behavior? I think, for example, misogyny should be a hate crime. And we're lobbying the government to make sure the harassment of women in the public place is a criminal offence. And it starts in the classroom. We make sure the police address some of the issues, all the issues raised by the Sarah Everard case, but also the criminal justice system as well. What we shouldn't be talking about is women changing their behavior to keep themselves safe. We should be targeting the behavior of men and boys to address our behavior in relation not just horrific murders, but the situation that if you're a woman or a girl, your life experiences, your life chances, your personal safety is less than it is if you're a boy or a man.
That is an incredible message. We've got less than a minute left, Mayor Khan, but I have to ask, as I mentioned in your intro, you're the first Muslim elected mayor of London. You were re-elected mayor. What does that say, your election and re-election? What does that say about London?
Well, I genuinely say this not just as a proud born and raised Londoner, but know that I'm speaking to proud American friends who live in great cities from Washington to New York, from LA to Chicago, is London is the great city in the world. I can't think of any other city that would have given my family the opportunity to fulfill our potential, to go from municipal housing, council housing in London, where I was born and raised, to be mayor of this great city. This city didn't just vote for somebody who is an ethnic minority, but one who is a religious minority, and that's the religion of Islam in the current context where, for a variety of reasons, a small number of people give our religion a bad name. So I'm incredibly proud of the vote I got in 2016 and 2021, and incredibly proud of this great city.
Mayor Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, you're giving me a lot of reasons to make a trip back to London. Thank you so much for coming to Washington Post Live.
Stay safe. Take care.
And thank you for tuning in. To check out our upcoming interviews, go to WashingtonPostLive.com to find out more information and register. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Once again, thank you for tuning in to Washington Post Live.